Welcome to another episode of the Lyceum of History. Today we're going to look at the Nile River. We have three goals in today's video. First, look at the geography of the Nile. Second, look at what the ancient Egyptians thought about the Nile. And third, the Nile today. Let's look at the geography of the Nile. The Nile is 4,130 miles long. There's two main tributaries, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, and they meet at Khartoum, Sudan. The White Nile begins in Lake Victoria, the Blue Nile in Lake Tana, and the Nile flows north towards the Mediterranean. It forms the Nile Delta, one of the richest farmlands in the world. The Nile was considered the source of life in ancient Egypt. In fact, their god Hapi was the god of the annual flooding. And the Nile had three distinct seasons. Akhet was the flooding season, where the Nile overflowed its banks. This lasted from June through September. Then there was Peret, the growing and planting season, in which the Nile waters receded, leaving behind a rich layer of silt. This lasted from October through February. And finally, there was Shamu, the harvesting season, when the Nile was dry and the crops were harvested. This lasted from March until May, and then the cycle would start over again. You can see an example in the illustration on the left, as well as the temple relief of the Egyptian god of the Nile. The geography of the Nile allowed trade and transportation to occur. It also served, along with the desert, as a natural border against invasions. There were 6 cataracts, or waterfalls, on the river, though, that made navigation difficult. The first was near Aswan and served as the border between Egypt and Nubia. And as you can see on the map, they all lie south of Egypt. And in the picture you can see an example of one such cataract. The Greek historian Herodotus notes the mystery surrounding the Nile's annual flooding. He writes, "Concerning the nature of the river Nile, I was not able to learn anything either from the priest or from others. What I desire to know, namely, why the Nile, beginning at the summer solstice, fills and overflows for 100 days, and after this time sinks and becomes less, so that all the rest of the time it flows within its banks. I was not able to learn anything from any of the Egyptians." He also highlights the importance of the Nile's inundation in making Egypt a fertile land, despite being surrounded by deserts. And as you can see on the map on the screen, they believe that the Nile began in the Atlas Mountains in what are now Morocco and Algeria, flowing through the Sahara into Ethiopia and entering Egypt before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. He writes, "Egypt, though it borders on Libya, is not a country of sand. The river Nile overflows in summer and irrigates the fields, so that the people who live in Egypt have 2 harvests each year." Herodotus also discusses the mystery of the Nile's length and its source. He writes, "As to the length of the Nile, no one knows for sure, for it is not known to anyone exactly where the Nile rises. It flows out of Libya and passes through Ethiopia, and from there it flows to Egypt. The river flows from the south towards the north, and the Egyptians say that it has a length of 4 months' journey." Another Greek historian, Ptolemy, describes the sources of the Nile as being in the mountains of the moon, which are believed to be located in the interior of Africa. He writes, "The Nile has its sources in a range of mountains called Lunae Montes, which are located in southern Africa, just below the equator." He goes on to detail the course of the Nile through Africa and Egypt. And he writes, "The Nile flows from these mountains northward through Ethiopia and then makes its way into Egypt before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea." And as you can see in the map of the screen, he attempts to map out the Nile River. Today, we know the sources of the Nile. It flows through 11 countries: Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Egypt. There are many modern issues facing the Nile. There are multiple dams on the Nile today, which have both positive and negative effects. Some of the pros are they control flooding, they provide hydroelectricity, they provide steady irrigation, they make for easier navigation, and they help create jobs. The cons, though, are that there is sediment trapping behind the dams, it displaces wildlife, causes water evaporation, and there's water right disputes between the countries involved, as well as people may need to move due to the new dam's location and the reservoir it creates. And you can see on the map on the screen several of the dams and their relative sizes, throughout the African continent. And as mentioned earlier, the Nile flows through 11 countries. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is currently in production and will exacerbate some of the problems mentioned before. The other major dam on the Nile is the Aswan High Dam, which was finished in 1970, providing hydroelectric power and controlled irrigation, but has led to sedimentation and the overuse of fertilizers. And you can see the map and the dam on the images to the left. Another problem today the Nile faces are foreign invasive species. Some examples are the Nile perch, which prey on native fish, the water hyacinth, which clogs waterways and reduces oxygen levels, tilapia, which outcompetes with native fish, the common carp increases cloudiness of the water and destroys aquatic plants, the apple snail, which harms vegetation, and the Louisiana crayfish, which prey on native fish and causes erosion. This is just some of the invasive species that have caused problems on the Nile today. In summary, the Nile has two branches, and it combined makes the longest river in the world. The ancients did their best to map it. It was important to ancient Egypt just as it is today. And there are environmental issues today that are going to require 21st century solutions. Thank you for watching this video from the Lyceum of History. If you liked it, consider subscribing and give it a thumbs up.